A scene I always look forward to in this movie is when Thor convinces his friends to join his reckless adventure to Jotunheim. The use of clever exposition to establish each character without an info dump is a trademark of quality scripts. Thor is deliberately drawing on things they all know, which is plausible, and tells us about Thor and each character in turn in a believable way, narrowly avoiding the age-old mistake of having characters discuss things they should all be familiar with in order to merely tell the audience something. But it also sets up the important subplot of his friends figuring out that Loki was behind everything and eventually going to Earth to rescue Thor.
At base, we've got Xena, Jackie Chan, and Robin Hood.
I've always loved these four and how they manage to be both funny and effective characters that evoke the fun feeling of an old action film without completely breaking the mood, and sadly, unlike Frigga and Heimdall, who would get very proper send-offs in later installments in the franchise, and we'll see Sif again in the next Thor, I feel like the Warriors 3 were brushed under the carpet in Ragnarok, which is a shame considering they've been part of Thor's world since 1965. Also note the Destroyer there on the cover. This was his second appearance.
You would defy the commands of Loki, our king. Break every oath you have taken as warriors and commit treason to bring Thor back.
Yes.
Good.
Speaking of Heimdall, Idris Elba is always cool to have around. Heimdall was in this film very little compared to some later films, and he's mostly a plot device to operate the Bifrost or see across galaxies. But he's got a simple elegance that makes him one of the first things that comes to my mind from this movie. Frigga is also here very little, but her few scenes are effective, and, like Heimdall, got quite a lot to do in later installments, and I don't feel like they wasted her either, in spite of how brief her appearances are.
Americans don't roll their R's, but in Icelandic we say Frigg.
So, let's take a look at the Earth cast. Apparently, Natalie Portman signed on mostly because Kenneth Branagh would be directing. Whatever her reason for joining the cast, Portman was apparently quite thrilled with the idea of Jane being a scientist and had quite a bit of input into Jane's characterization, drawing inspiration from historical scientists, notably Rosalind Franklin, who performed groundbreaking research in the study of DNA. I've got to be honest, Jane is far more interesting than I realized in previous viewings. The original Jane Foster was introduced way back in 1962 in the second Thor comic ever published. But there's a significant change to her 2011 incarnation. Comics Jane was a nurse in love with Don Blake, Thor's alter ego. Changing Jane into an astrophysicist was, in my opinion, a great idea, and the end result is a character who is active in the plot and very different from most of Thor's friends, someone he wouldn't find in Asgard. She also seems to be a counterbalance for Lady Sif, who in later films would be revealed to have feelings for Thor, like her comics and mythological counterparts. But while Sif is a warrior, Jane is a thinker, but still similar to Thor in many ways. Hot-headed, full of youthful energy, she also strikes a good balance between being intelligent, feisty, and assertive, which helps her participate in advancing the plot while not sacrificing her girlish charm. And in contrast to Thor, she's far more ready to admit when she's made a mistake.
Hi Eric, it's me. Don't worry, I'm fine, but just in case you don't hear from me in the next hour, just come by the crater site and try and find me, okay? I did exactly what you told me not to. I'm sorry. So sorry. Bye.
Now, Selvig and Darcy were likely the result of needing a sounding board for Jane to talk to, but that didn't stop the filmmakers from giving them some proper characterization, especially for characters who aren't from any of the comics. Darcy was always a fun character because she's just funny in a dry kind of way, and she still is. There are other things I'd like to say about how her character developed in some later MCU stuff, but I'd get into some major spoilers for a certain other thing. Anyway, I never noticed before how Eric seems like the Earth Dad counterpart to Odin in Asgard, looking after two girls instead of two boys. Even though he's not their father, he does act like one at times, offering his wisdom when they are too focused on the moment or being impetuous, and ends up offering Thor advice when he's unsure of what to do. He's even set up as the dad that Thor has to befriend in order to court Jane. But while Odin can wield absolute authority, Selvig uses reason, and sometimes achieves results faster than Odin. But he's also ready to be flexible, keeping in line with the theme that Thor can learn from people on Earth. He's also the one who tries to pick up the pieces when things fall apart. Coulson, another authority figure. Unlike his prior two appearances, he's this time set in opposition to the protagonists. Like the others with responsibility, we see how difficult his job is, being in the tough spot of trying to understand what kind of trouble is brewing in the desert. He's placed between the two worlds and has to make some very tricky judgment calls, and thank goodness he doesn't think like Thor does at the beginning. Being a sympathetic version of an archetype that we still see done to death a decade later remains refreshing, and he makes an impression regardless of whether or not the viewer has seen him in the two Iron Man films.
Barton, talk to me.
Hawkeye's first appearance is worth a mention, because Renner is very much in character, and one can see how cool he would be once we got to see him a little bit more.
You better call it, Coulson. 'Cause I'm starting to root with this guy.
Now we come to Thor, the heart of the film. Hemsworth, a newcomer to American cinema back then, auditioned for the role twice before landing it, and purportedly put on 20 pounds of muscle. It's odd to remember a time when the choice of who would play Thor was uncertain, but once upon a time, this was something people argued about in comment sections. Today, most people would agree they couldn't have found a better choice, and after 10 years, I was impressed all over again. Now, if you haven't noticed, a major theme of this movie is how one deals with a position of authority. And Thor's story is about becoming humble and learning to be worthy of the hammer, to go from one who needs guidance to the man of wisdom who will provide it by spending time as a mortal. And I was thunderstruck to learn while making this video that this idea of Thor being banished from Asgard and learning to be humble among mortals can be traced back to one of the earliest Marvel stories, where he was sent to Earth in a mortal form, with no memory of his true self, as the lame Donald Blake, where he became a doctor and learned humility. Despite discarding the idea of amnesia and dual identity, this first film is very much an updated version of that story.
Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor.
At the start, Thor is brash and is too ready to unleash something he doesn't understand.
You know not what your actions would unleash. I do.
Earning his exile from Odin. Despite seeming bonkers to the Earthcast, he also brings a fairy tale charm to the everyday lives of Foster and Darcy, and even Selvig in a way.
We drank, we fought, he made his ancestors proud.
I love how these cultural differences are handled, because he's not just some jerk learning to be better, but more of a diamond in the rough who can learn to be the best of both worlds, but can't lift Mjolnir until then.
All the answers you seek will be yours once I reclaim Mjolnir.
Mjolnir? What's Mjolnir?
So Mjolnir is actually Mjolnir. Mjolnir. With the strong R.
It's time to stop! It's time to stop, okay? No more!
I can do this all day.
Yeah, I know.
Sorry, I love memes, and if by chance you do want to hear some more Icelandic, there is a link in the description. Anyways, Thor's lowest point in the story begins when, after fighting through a bunch of S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, he's unable to lift Mjolnir. The camera even tilts ever so slightly in one shot, perhaps to say that the world will move before Mjolnir will budge for one who is not worthy. Something the scene avoids is making our hero helpless, a very common fallback in stories where superheroes lose their powers. Even as a mortal, he still has the fighting skills and the heart of a hero. As an Old Testament god, he is all but impervious to physical harm and will only thrive in a battle. But he's lacking and vulnerable to a pain beyond the physical, the torment of having Mjolnir in reach, but denied to him for reasons he can't understand. This isn't a problem strength will solve, but it's this pain that starts to change him, and he hits rock bottom when Loki tells him that Odin has died and that he must remain in exile as a mortal.
I am sorry. Thank you for coming here.
Now, it's worth noting that for all his brashness, Thor always had certain good qualities. Among them, support for those he believes in, something that doesn't change even when his powers are gone, but rather comes to the forefront. Remember that scene when he reminds his friends of how he supported them in the past? After Thor brings Selvig back from their presumably epic drinking match, he and Jane go up to the roof, where we're shown firsthand how he inspires those he cares about.
S.H.I.E.L.D., whatever they are, they're gonna do everything in their power to make sure this research never sees the light of day.
No, Jane. Listen to me, you must not give up. You must finish what you started.
Why?
Because you're right. Here, look.
This is the quality that assures us, the audience, that he's capable of becoming worthy, of being a king. This scene is also the definition of showing versus telling, and right after we see his friends back in Asgard decide to defy Loki and come to his aid. After seeing this side of him, we can well understand their devotion. Meanwhile, Thor, still convinced by Loki's lie that he can never go home again, seems to have resigned himself to this new world and might be content in this simpler life as a mortal, something the old Thor would not have been capable of. But the real confirmation of his newfound humbleness arrives with the crisis.
Have you done all you can?
No, I will die a warrior's death. Stories will be told of this day.
Live and tell those stories yourself.
This exchange with Sif is indicative of his change. He has become less concerned with glory, and his selfless act of sacrifice to spare the small town from the horror of war is the moment he becomes a New Testament god. As far as Thor knew, the hammer would never be his again. Nothing he did was with the motivation of becoming worthy of it, or in pursuit of glory, but because it was right. With Mjolnir back in his grip, he returns to Asgard to settle matters with Loki, who had set the Bifrost to destroy Jotunheim in his bid for power. Thor destroys the Bifrost, saving the very people he was ready to fight at the start of his arc, and when it's all over, Loki slips away into a black hole, and Jane is out of reach. Another sacrifice on his journey. The Thor we're left with in the end isn't sitting at the table in celebration. He's a somber, stoic man feeling the weight of his power, who has earned the right to be the mighty Thor. Does Thor still stand up 10 years later? In my opinion, it shines as brightly as old Asgard. The filmmakers crafted something with less in common with a superhero movie and more akin to epic fantasy. They took a straightforward story and made it rich rather than complex. Of course, there's things that maybe could be improved, a bit of dialogue here or there, but nothing worth mentioning. The bit at the end where Thor is wondering if he'll ever be able to see Jane again doesn't have much weight to it after the many journeys he's made to Earth in the intervening years, but we always knew he'd be back. It literally said so at the end. Today, it's easy to take all these films for granted, but rewatching Thor, then doing all the research, took me back to a time when accurate interpretations of superheroes were rare on the big screen. Thor was part of the new wave that actually gave us the character, as though brought to life from the pages of a comic, winged helmet and all, and it was our first real look at that larger world Nick Fury talked about back in Iron Man. But its entertainment value isn't restricted to being an episode of the MCU. It's a tale of growth, brave heroes, dastardly villains, fair damsels, noble deeds, and romance, told with marvelous scale and intelligence, and above all, it's fun. Branagh and his team made, in my humble opinion, a most worthy film that will continue to entertain decades from now. I don't like committing myself to saying when a work of art is the best. Everything has different requirements. However, I do think Thor is a top-tier film, and might be the most underrated installment of the MCU canon. But this is all just my opinion. Did you realize the decade had slipped by and pop in Thor? If so, what do you think? Let me know down in the comments, and think about giving this video a like and maybe hitting that subscribe button. It really helps with the algorithm. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.